Welcome, everyone. I'm Richard Shyness, and I'm the Dean of the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Dietrich Deep Dive. This idea came about when we had many discussions about the election and the issues surrounding it, and we're all a bit frustrated by how shallow the newspaper coverage can be. And we realized we had many experts on these topics that are on our faculty. And so we created a series of talks to give them an excuse to talk to us and to you about a little deeper treatment about these issues. So today it's a pleasure to have Simon DeDeo and Gretchen Chapman. Simon is going to speak about the psychology of conspiracy theories. Gretchen is going to moderate, and I am just going to introduce Gretchen and then get out of the way. So Gretchen Chapman is a professor in the Social and Decision Sciences Department. And she does many topics and pieces of research related to this. She was a former editor at Psychological Science and a past president of the Society for Judgment and Decision Making. She is the author of more than 100 journal articles and has received 20 years of funding on these topics. And so it's a delight to have Gretchen. Gretchen, take it away, and I look forward to this talk.
Thanks, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. I am thrilled to introduce my amazing colleague, Simon DeDeo, who is an assistant professor in social and decision sciences here in Dietrich College, and he's also an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. Simon has a PhD from Princeton in astrophysics. Take that, Mellon College of Science. He completed postdocs at the University of Tokyo and the University of Chicago, and he had a previous faculty appointment in complex systems and cognitive science at Indiana University before he joined us here at CMU. He will soon hold the title of William S. Dietrich Career Development Chair here in Dietrich beginning this July. Simon is the quintessential CMU interdisciplinary scholar. He takes a data science approach to understanding human minds, exploring how human behavior, norms, and status evolve over time. He uses concepts from machine learning to analyze large data sets, such as the literal pecking order of birds, or data scraped from Wikipedia to illuminate how norms evolve, or data from political discourse during the French Revolution, which reveals the success of various types of arguments. Our topic today, of course, is conspiracy theories. You probably, many of you heard some of these conspiracy theories from recent news media, such as the belief that COVID-19 is a hoax, or that the COVID vaccine contains a microchip that's going to control our behavior, that the presidential election was stolen, or that the power elites in Washington engage in satanic worship and pedophilia. And you might be wondering, how could it be that people believe in such things? And what could we do to change their minds? Simon is here to shed light on those questions and tell us about the psychology behind these conspiracy beliefs. I just want to remind you that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and you can post your questions at any time during Simon's talk, and then we'll have a very interesting discussion after he's finished with his remarks. So take it away, Simon.
All right. Let me pull this up. Gretchen, thank you for that very gracious introduction. I'm always amused. People always bring up that I have a PhD in astrophysics, and I think it's meant to suggest this is very abstract and strange thing to study. But when I was in graduate school, actually, we were looked down upon by the string theorists because astrophysics was considered too practical, right? Because stars and galaxies, they actually existed. So these days, I feel somewhat justified in looking at, I would say, some of the really messy and practical things that I get to study today. So I'm going to talk about the psychology of conspiracy theories, the underlying cognitive things that happen when people start to believe them. But what I want to begin with is the fact that we are misled, I would say, by the strangeness of conspiracy theories. One of the questions that has come in for us is, do people really believe this? And that surface strangeness, I want to say, is a distraction from the fact that conspiracy theories are actually on a continuum with healthy, what you might call healthy epistemic practices. And so if, for example, you think of a conspiracy theory as a cancer, we can't understand the cancer until we understand how it's part of a healthy body gone wrong. This is a quote from David Deutsch, a great physicist, actually, who talks in particular about the nature of explanation making. All progress, both theoretical and practical, has resulted from a single human activity, the quest for good explanations. So Ben Franklin, great Pennsylvania physicist, is an example of a person who devoted his life, in fact, to explaining the world, to explaining the physical world, but also the social world. He was a man driven, I would say, by one of the universal human drives, the drive to explain things. The claim here is that our drive to explain things, our drive to explain the world, is responsible not just for the best, but also for the worst of our species. We want to understand, in some sense, how the right image is the other face, the shadow side of the one on the left. Both of these people are trying to explain the world. In one case, it's gone wrong. So let's just begin. What are explanations? You know these, but it's worth, and I think sort of beautiful to kind of to talk about the great variety. I was asked for my quals to explain why the stars shine, right? Some people are asked, explain where life comes from. Don't dumb it down or I'll kill you, right? Explain, how did Biden win Georgia, right? Explain, how is Elon Musk not in a psych ward, right? How is he able to, beat NASA and the automobile industry when he's obviously nuts, right? So these are explanations maybe of impersonal events, but we also try to produce explanations at a more human scale, right? You might ask, if this is the case, why is my child struggling at school? How can I explain that? Why is my partner upset this evening? On the really micro scales, why does this meal taste funny? Like, what's wrong here? Things we explain just in a second. Why did she look at me on the bus? Explanations are, from the very large to the very small, a demand to answer, why does the world look this way? It's worth making a distinction here. In Dietrich, we do explanations. The computer science school, the School for Computer Science, mostly does prediction, right? Machine learning, by and large, is about prediction. I'm going to say prediction is simple, right? As Yogi Berra said, it's especially about the past. But in general, even if it's hard to make a correct prediction, it's usually easy to know if we've gotten it right, right? So if we're trying to sort of foretell the future, that could be a very hard task to do, but we generally agree, once the future comes to us, whether or not we got it right, who got it better than somebody else. Explanation, however, is a much more fraught thing, right? Explanation doesn't say, given what I have to hand, how well can I predict what's happening next? But given the data I have to hand, how well can I explain what happened? In that case, we often battle. We often disagree very strongly about which explanation is better. So you might say, look, that's a really beautiful, elegant explanation you made there, but there's a lot of missing pieces. Or conversely, you might say, okay, yes, fine, your explanation, I mean, it really covers everything, but maybe there's a simpler explanation hidden in here somewhere. So one of the things I've been working on this year and the past 2 years, actually, with Zach Waltrowicz, who's a PhD student in social and decision sciences, is what you might think of as a unified theory of explanatory values. We're trying to tell a story about all the different aspects of an explanation that we might find satisfying or pleasing. And in particular, the kinds of explanations or the kinds of properties of an explanation that we might be drawn to, that make us accept one explanation over another. So how do we do this? We use Bayes' theorem, which you may have encountered. I won't teach you Bayes' theorem, but I'll just talk you through it a little bit. We say that people begin with the question, how probable is this explanation? How likely is this explanation given the evidence? We can actually split that into two parts. How probable is the evidence given the explanation, multiplied by this sort of background probability of how likely the explanation is in general. So this divides explanatory values into two pieces, right? You can make the pink higher by making the green higher or making the blue higher. If you make the green higher, what you're doing is figuring out ways to describe or predict or talk about the things that have already happened. We call those empirical values. There are two main ones we've discovered, and this fits with a lot of psychological experiments people have done in labs. There's two sort of empirical values. One is, how well does it cover the facts? And the second one, which will be a big part of this talk today, is how well does it link the facts together? How well does it say not just this happened and this happened, but also that these two things happen perhaps because of a hidden common cause? On the other side, we have two theoretical values. How well does this explanation kind of fit explanations that I know kind of work in this domain? And this very mysterious one, which we'll touch on a little bit, is how simple is the explanation, which turns out to be one of the deepest questions in science. These are all values. These are things that make an explanation something we like. In general, they compete with each other, right? So this is the kind of epistemic version of faster, better, cheaper, pick two, right? So here we have, on the one hand, what we call the empirical facts. How well can the empirical values of an explanation? How well can I account for what's going on? And how well does what I'm telling you link things together? We gave them fancy names, right? Because you got to market this stuff, right? So descriptiveness and co-explanation. On the other hand, these two chunks, we call them, these are the theoretical ones, almost case-driven ones, right? And these two things can fight. You can make an explanation, for example, more empirically satisfying at the cost of making it less theoretically satisfying. So for example, like, that's great, Gretchen, like you've explained everything that's happening in our department, but it's not that simple. And so I don't like the explanation as much as I like Richard's, right? So these things battle. And they not only battle between the empirical and the theoretical, right? The astronomers and the string theorists, right? But they also battle even within each of those domains. So let me give you an example. This is a within domain competition. I'm going to tell you some facts, and then I'm going to give you examples of ways to explain this, right? So you start a new job, you're new in the office, right? And you're walking home one day and you see James and Jane leaving the movie theater together, like they're just walking out at the same time. A few days later, you notice that they've both taken vacation days at the same time. So these are the things you want to explain this, right? So let's take these axes here. On the one hand, you're satisfying one of the empirical values. This is descriptivity. And we'll go to this other explanation on the other extreme, but let's take the descriptive one. How do you explain this? Well, look, I guess they both like superhero movies, and relax, it's July, people take vacations, right? So this is a descriptive thing. It says these facts, people like superhero movies, pretty likely, and it's July, right? So let's go to the other extreme, right? A more co-explanatory explanation, which is like, oh my God, they're having an affair. I know it, they're having an affair, right? So on the one hand, you have a certain kind of explanation. The world is just likely coincidences. On the other hand, a world made of hidden causes, underlying theories, stories, and narratives that connect things together. This axis here, moving from the descriptive to the co-explanatory, and I'm sure you know people who fall on the blue side or the red side, right? I tend, hate to say, I think well of everybody, right? But I tend to fall somewhat on the co-explanatory side. And I think that's not an accident, in part because of my earlier scientific training. So we as a species, noticed maybe 100, 150 years ago at least, that our best scientific theories actually had high levels of co-explanation. They tended to link things together. So this is an example. This is William Whewell, right? He was like the Richard Shyness of 1847 at Cambridge. And Whewell was trying to figure out, why is the science thing so great? Like, what are the secrets to science? So he gives this example. He says, look, once upon a time we had this problem, and he called it colors of thin plates. So this is like oil on a puddle makes these rainbow colors. So we saw this and we had an explanation. It was called the theory of alternate fits. Right? We also had another phenomenon. It was called fringes of shadows at the time. This is, if you've heard of this phrase, the double slit experiment, doesn't really matter. And we had a theory that explained that. It was called the doctrine of interferences. 2 phenomena, 2 explanations. One day, somebody noticed that the doctrine of interferences could also explain the colors of thin plates. And Whewell says, because of that, we stuck with the doctrine of interferences. We liked that, and we threw out the theory of alternate fits. So like, what's going on here? Fundamentally, these physicists are saying fringes and colors are having an affair. I know it. There's some connection here. And, by the way, right, this is literally the beginning of quantum mechanics, right? So this is a huge intellectual moment for us based around a certain preference for explanations. So we did some really fun stuff about trying to see when this moment happened in science, when these kind of great points in time where explanations started to work. So here's a map of science. Each of these circles is an idea. Lines between them are people connecting them together, sort of the prehistory of science. Somewhere around 1720, things start to change. Proud to say this is probably Ben Franklin actually kicks this off. And by the end of the 1800s, you actually see that we've connected things together in ways that make sense. We've dug around in this. You can look, here's a little chunk of late 19th century physics. You'll notice we've connected electricity and magnetism. We know that these two things have somehow something to do with each other. But you'll notice we haven't actually worked out that light is a form of electromagnetism. There's this sort of missing link. But it turns out actually we can predict that missing link is going to enter. And it looks like we might be able to predict the future of scientific progress, simply based around this rule that William Whewell worked out, that successful chunks of science have high co-explanatory value. So let me just walk you through that. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you how things go wrong, but let's just enjoy this moment of well done, humankind, right? Electricity, magnetism, this conspiracy of electromagnetism, right? Secretly, electricity and magnetism are being controlled by this field. We call it A mu, right? And then, I noticed in the lab just these very subtle, like weird things that are, weird sort of facts about radiation, about Geiger counter decays. And you know what? I think everything is connected, and there's a Higgs boson, and we're going to find it. So this is this amazing moment for us, right? It's a part of our species' success. What we've done here is combine values, and you might say we've made them some of our best virtues. All right. So what happens when values become vices? So I'll give you two examples here. The first example is what happens if we overrate descriptiveness, meaning that we're sort of unwilling to believe in a senseless world. So I'll give you an example of a conspiracy theory. This is a theory that centers around the Oklahoma City bombing that happened in 1995, the largest terrorist attack, white supremacist terrorist attack in the United States up until that point. I'll tell you briefly a story about this attack. So the man who pulled it off was a guy called Timothy McVeigh. You may remember the name. Timothy McVeigh builds in secret with one or two co-conspirators, builds in secret a gigantic fertilizer bomb, packs it into a U-Haul truck and drives it into the parking lot of the federal building in Oklahoma City. The thing, he blows it up, it destroys the building. It actually, it's horrifying what actually happened here. I won't go into it. But nobody knows what's going on. This is, in some sense, a magnum opus of destruction. Nobody can figure it out, right? This is a mastermind plot. What happens next? Timothy McVeigh gets in a car 10 minutes after the bombing. He gets in a car. The car doesn't have license plates, okay? He gets on the highway and he's speeding in a car with no license plates. He gets pulled over by a cop. The cop sees he's got a gun on the seat and arrests him for having an unlicensed weapon, right? It's only when he's in jail for 3 days that they work out he's the guy, right? So here's the question. How could a mastermind who pulled off this incredibly sophisticated attack literally do something so stupid as to, even I know, don't do this, right? Don't drive a car without license plates. And if you are, like, keep it low key. So, how do we explain this? The world is weird. People are weird, right? Or McVeigh didn't do it. How could such a moron do this? In fact, this is a grand conspiracy. It's a false flag operation, and a far more sophisticated group pulled this off. Here's another example, co-explanation, the attraction, let's say, of a unified world. I'll talk a little bit about QAnon. Here is the QAnon belief network. I want you to think about this as sort of the scientific network I showed you before, just gone magically or massively wrong. So now, instead of connecting electricity and magnetism, like Walt Disney is connected to, the Order of the Black Sun and Nikola Tesla and, maybe, John Trump. Another example, and this is the sovereign citizens movement. I will tell you a story. I had an encounter with the sovereign citizens movement, and if we have time in the Q&A, I will tell you my story on that. So let's run explanation gone wrong for this first example I gave you of the Oklahoma City bombing. So here's your two things, right? Not, shadows and colors, right? But instead, look, there was this meticulous bombing, and then McVeigh is, he's speeding without license plates. So how do you explain these, right? It's a false flag. This was pulled off by actually other members of the government. So now you have this problem, right? Journalists didn't notice this, right? Well, okay, journalists are corrupt, right? The journalists are in on this and they're part of the false flag. Okay, the journalists are corrupt, right? But the police, you can't even trust the police. Who can you trust? I mean, the people who tell these stories have that kind of view these days. The police saw nothing, right? But one guy did, and he was killed, right? But he was killed by the FBI because the FBI hires contract killers. And in fact, this is all being controlled by another deeper conspiracy that's both involved with the fact that the FBI is secretly the exact opposite of what you think the FBI is and so on, right? So the problem here is not what's in the blue. The problem is everything else outside the blue you need to make the blue work. So we've been wondering how people end up in this space. And actually, this is work with another SDS researcher. This is Chloe Perry. We've started telling a story, explaining everything, right? So we're explaining this with what we call epistemic counter communities. And these can form online or off. The online ones are the ones we study just because, we have computers, right? These are groups that validate and encourage bad behaviors, and in particular, bad epistemic values. So if you tell this story with this, gigantic network of red nodes here, I tell this to Gretchen, she says, Simon, these are not good explanations. Forget whether or not the New York Times is corrupt, something is going wrong for you, right? But what these people do, we think people who get very deep into it end up in these epistemic counter communities that allow them to persist in making these increasingly odd, yet co-explanatory explanations. They also do all these things like provide some of the social benefits of a normal community. These supporting networks can, we think, be surprisingly hard to uproot. It's not enough to tell somebody, look, people are complicated. McVeigh, he's got two sides. Maybe he's a mastermind, but maybe he's also a fool. You can't fix the blue part. Because even if you fix the blue part, look at how much stuff is left, right? This person still believes that the FBI hires contract killers, right? So they're surprisingly hard to change. And the other thing, and I think this is something that we are trying to explore, is that if you're a member of these epistemic, or one of these epistemic counter communities, you begin to get alienated from friends and family. And why is that? And maybe I'm a little biased here. I mean, literally, if you love explaining too much, this is the job you end up with. But I will say, no matter who you are, one of the nicest things to do in life is to sit around and explain things to each other. That's just part of human life, right? You're with your family. Okay, sometimes you share experiences. You say, look at the beautiful sun, right? But you wait long enough and people try to explain things. Why are the Bulls so bad this year, right? Why is Aunt Sally, I'll tell you all about Aunt Sally. Let me explain why she was so nutty last Thanksgiving, right? These are the things we do. They're deeply pleasing to us, but they're only pleasing to us, of course, if the explanations we share have common values. So, around the dinner table, and in some sense, this is the rough folk version, right? We're talking about politics. And at some point, someone's like, well, right, that adrenochrome is actually in the water. And it's the reason that the Wall Street Journal is always saying this. All of a sudden, this is not, forget whether it's racist or sexist, right? This is not a fun story. It's not a fun explanation. People kind of go quiet, even if it's not, let's say, morally awkward. So this is one of the major downsides here. One of the questions that came up, and I think this is a really important thing that we struggled with, right? Do people actually believe this stuff? Right? Do they really believe there's a gigantic conspiracy, let's say, behind the Oklahoma City bombing? And I think this question is a little bit like, do people believe in astrology, right? Do you read your horoscope? I'm a Gemini, right? I do it, right? But look, there's many things you can do, right? It's sort of amusing, In fact, there's actually some beautiful research in cultural evolution that suggests that these kinds of foretelling games, essentially like the I Ching, are actually potentially useful as mental heuristics. They're kind of beneficial randomness, one of the reasons they persist. Okay. So this is fine. Do you really believe astrology if you read the column in Cosmopolitan and you laugh and you say, oh, you know, right? Is the, you know, the Chinese bureaucrat who pulls out the I Ching, right? Maybe this is not, you know, does he believe in it? Does he not? Okay, but then there's this kind of extreme version, right? Do you guide your life according to your horoscope, right? Do these beliefs have huge impacts on your life, or are they just sort of pleasant, satisfying things? I'll give you an example from my own life, right? I believe in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics that says all of this world that we see is an illusion. We, in fact, live in a space that's incomprehensible, infinite dimensional. And for example, if you shoot yourself in the right way, you will in fact not die and live forever, right? So I, you know, given the opportunity, I will explain this to you at length. I find it deeply beautiful. Don't worry, I don't walk in front of cars, right? I live in the classical world very, very well. Right? So we may find explanations pleasing or satisfying, right? But what it means to actually believe them is something that Chloe and I and many of us have wrestled with. So what we did, or one way to make sense of this, is to partition, and of course we're interested in the real dark stuff here, to partition an extremist ideology, a conspiracy theory, into two pieces. The explanation stuff, right? What I've been talking about at length, the ways in which we sign on to explanations, the ways in which we enjoy them. But also behavior, the things we do. And you need both of these pieces to truly ruin your life. Okay, if you're a member of an epistemic counter community and all you do is explain things in a strange way, maybe you're just a crank, right? I mean, I can ruin Thanksgiving dinner with quantum mechanics just as well as somebody can ruin it with their theory of adrenochrome. But when things become a serious public policy problem, when they begin to affect us just beyond our families, is when the red and the blue combine. That the things we believe begin to influence the things we do. So let me give you an example. We've studied this in particular, sexist ideology. So we have these explanations, people who are sexist. Sexism is in some sense a theory of the world, right? So it says, you know, I'm going to explain a bunch of things that you see through a set of explanations that involve women being inferior to men. So for example, women cannot be responsible political agents. These are extreme views, right? We encounter them. I'll give you some examples. And, you know, how do we explain that? Well, you know, maybe it was because how, you know, evolution made men smarter than women, or, you know, women gather berries and men hunt mammoths, and like gathering berries is, you know, bad for democracy. I don't know, right? People can hold this, right? And you may know people who hold this, but who are generally good people. It's like, just don't ask him about evolutionary psychology, right? It's a little bit like this phenomenon of people who hold racist beliefs, but also have plenty of black friends, or at least so they claim. That's not entirely implausible, as long as the red doesn't transfer over to the blue. But when it does, then things get problematic. Because if you have an explanation for the world that involves women are being inferior to men, and this is fitting together in some deeply satisfying way for you, and now you transfer it over to behavior. So for example, the behavior might say, if a woman attempts to take political power, she should be mocked and scolded, discriminated against, right? This is the Hillary story. She should perhaps, and this happened in Britain, she should has to be assaulted and even killed. So both of these have to combine. Which comes first? So now the key question is, maybe we've explained, okay, cognitive science is beautiful, it's a little abstract. We know about explanatory values. We understand the structure of the red. Now we want to know how the red connects to the blue. We have thought about this for many, many generations. Pascal, the philosopher, after Pascal's wager, when he said, look, believe in God, because if it's true, you have everlasting life. And if it's not, well, you'll never be around to work it out. He then follows up and he says, look, I've argued that you should believe in God. So how do you do this? He said, don't worry about the red, right? Don't worry about the theological explanations. Just behave, kneel and pray. The beliefs come later. So Pascal says, in fact, that the blue precedes the red. So, okay, Chloe and I turned on the machines again. And we went online and we looked at, in particular, an online conspiracy theory known as the red pill. You may have heard this phrase. It's roughly speaking, it's a conspiracy theory with very strong sexist elements. So what's going on here? It has a deep structure. It has a deep account of the way the world works. But what are the facts it's trying to explain? So when you watch people show up in these groups, and in particular, we can track them on sites like Reddit, they come in seeking, or at least being given, explanations for the things like the following. Mostly these men are 17 to 21, basically. Girls, they don't want to go out with you. Why? Explain this. Why can't I get a girlfriend? My girlfriend cheated on me. Why? Right? You get some older men, my wife left. Why? So these are the kinds of things that people are demanding explanations for on these sites. Now, all of these questions for many, certainly I have been unable as a young man to get a partner, right? Most of us have experienced some kind of infidelity in our early lives, perhaps, right? These are things that, we wonder about them. We try to understand them. And usually we come up with, let's call them descriptive explanations. There's lots of things happening. It's idiosyncratic, the particular time, the person, the stage of life. The red pill guys, and I want you to think about this network as essentially equivalent. We built this exactly the same way we built the network for science, right? Divides up into these kinds of sub-disciplines, right? There's a chunk here associated with people self-help and literally like don't eat the estrogen soy, right? There's a group, a sort of set of interlocked ideas dealing with hierarchy and status. Like, what does it mean to be an alpha male? I gotta emphasize this is all made up, right? We have a piece in the blue, it's called men's rights activism. It's a kind of older thing, some are sitting around from the 70s. I'll just reveal this yellow thing is it's kind of, these are somewhat peripheral. But the key part here, the key kind of core, right? The red nodes sitting way deep down, way behind the false flag stories, right? The big conspiracies, that's the orange and the red. So we look at these, we try and work out what's going on. We read examples of theories from each of these places. I'm sorry, it's a terrible slide. There's so many, don't panic, right? What we realize is that there's basically two clumps here. We have a behavioral clump and we have an explanatory clump. The orange and the red is trying to explain things. The blue and the yellow are trying to tell people what to do, right? Here's how to behave towards women, right? Next question, let's try and answer to a certain extent Pascal's deep question, which is which comes first, right? Somebody shows up in these groups. So we track them, we do some clever hidden Markov modeling, it's called, right? What we're trying to do is, by watching a person's external semantics, right? What they're typing and posting about, can we make sense of sort of what's inside them and what's predictive about the future, right? So each of these nodes here is a kind of mental state, kind of coarse-grained mental state the person can be in. Left-hand side, we call them tourists, right? They're actually not that interesting. These are people who, right? They enter the group and they're like, whoa, I'm out, right? 90% of the people are this group. So this is a fact. Most people who touch this walk away. There's an enormous halo, right? This right-hand side, we call them the residents. So the residents, the tourists spend literally minutes, right? Sometimes just one post, right? The residents spend months, years on these sites. In fact, in a different data set we have, there's somebody who shows up at 21, right? And he's still there at 40. This is from the older groups, right? It's like something, this is sometimes deeply tragic. So sitting within this red clump here, these are the people who are staying, and we're saying, okay, when you start in the enter-exit state there, you enter the system, you take the right-hand branch, what's going on for you? What we find is the appealing aspects, right? How people enter the red are the behavioral things. I mean, literally things like, okay, how do I eat right? How do I beat depression? How do I lose weight? How do I stop watching porn, right? So there are these behavioral aspects. These seem to be the appealing ones. The sticky aspects are the explanatory ones. Come for the behavior, stay for the explanation. Roughly speaking, this is the Pascalian theory, right? It turns out the way people get to these explanations gone wrong, right, is beginning at least in part with the behavioral aspects. So thank you for listening to me explain things. I hope this was like a satisfying set of explanations. Where were we? Where did we begin? I began with a unified, co-explanatory theory of explanation. giving a sort of broad picture of how we think humans approach this task. I then told you, because like, let's celebrate ourselves as a species, right? I talked about explanations going right, the ways in which explanatory drives enable us to, at least in this case, make sense of the world in ways that literally has transformed us. Then there is this flip side. There is a flip side where we push too far on some of the values that are good, right? It's like we're just eating candy or butter. There are things that in small amounts are satisfying and, let's say, healthy, right? You need some fat, right, in your diet. But you can gorge yourself on some aspects that are, or should be, at least eaten in moderation. So thank you. We have plenty of time for questions. Professor Chapman will moderate, and I will turn off my screen share.
All right, Simon, I want to thank you for an incredibly interesting talk and a rich discussion. And could you tell us what is coming up next with deep dives?
Well, you know, I'm really glad you asked, Gretchen, because here, coming up next, voter suppression and voter fraud. So there should be information on your screen there about how to find that. That's May 13th. So I guess about 2 weeks from now.
Let me thank everybody for coming, and fantastic talk, Simon. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to have learned so much that I am not Henry James, but I am like William Whewell. But what I wanted to tell you that you don't know is that all the chocolates in my office are all in capital letters. So I'll leave you with that fact and look very eagerly forward to the time you can come into my office and check out that fact. So thank you for coming, everybody. And I hope to see you on Thursday, May 13th with voter suppression and voter fraud. But thanks, Simon. Thanks, Gretchen. That was extremely interesting and enjoyable. Have a great day, everyone, and avoid the snow.